Stephen with the Positive Identity podcast series. Ron, how's everything going?
Everything's going fantastic, Stephen. How are you doing this beautiful Thursday afternoon?
It is a beautiful, warm weather day in beautiful Los Angeles. And as far as I'm concerned, we are going to have a great time today. We have a phenomenal guest.
I'm super excited.
She's from Christianity Today, and she is awesome. And she's going to sort of like give us a lot of really perspective about how Christianity can be a positive force and has been a positive force when it comes to race relations. Obviously, we remember the abolitionist era, remember the civil rights era. And today, as America changes, maybe it's time again for Christianity to sort of rise up and be that force to guide us as we sort of figure out how we need to go as a society. So I'm pumped. I'm really excited.
I'm really excited. I didn't tell her yet, but I was raised Southern Baptist, and and I was just watching this morning. I was watching the funeral to the great and honorable John Lewis, and just kind of going on to what you were saying today, a few minutes ago, is just how powerful faith drove the civil rights movement to where we're at today, and the shoulders that African Americans stand on. And the country stands on with right. People of faith that were purpose driven by that faith, and how strong faith in God motivated people under the most harsh conditions to march and to organize and to strive to be better people. And how I was raised in White Oak Baptist Church as a kid, and how the church has always been such a focal community, a focal center within the communities that I was raised in, and how much faith has been challenged recently.
Yeah,
and trying to let people know that regardless of what your belief is, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or, whatever that may be, that you have a higher purpose, that you serve a higher purpose. And, knowing who she is, I'm just really interested to hear what her perspectives are on that. She's obviously very active in that work. And I would love to hear what she has to say about, the things that are going on today myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, hey, I'm Team Christian. My mom used to be Catholic, dad Protestant, but we went to a number of different churches, and I'm all Christian all the way. And so it's like, all right, as a Boston guy, someone on the team showing up, we're gonna have a great time today. And so, if right, you're taking it in the more mature way, talking about John Lewis and all that. I'm taking it in the all right. How's it going, friend? But it's one of those things where we as Christians, we're, love thy neighbor as thyself, but you can't show favoritism either. That's finding that balance between being that positive force of developing a positive self-identity, a love for yourself, which is actually something that not a lot of people do, and then actualizing it for other people. Whether you're Asian, love yourself, Black, love yourself, Hispanic, Latin, love yourself, White, love yourself, Native, love yourself. If you have a mixed background, love yourself, and even beyond. It's like anything, we're in a marriage with each other, and, finding that love for what that person is and all the aspects allows us to deal with the fact that we're all very flawed and we do things to hurt each other. And it's like, what are the things that we're doing good, positive for each other? We'll focus on that, and then we'll bring in the things that we need to fix each other on. And then that's how we can start to build something that hopefully can be one day be beautiful. And so I'm super excited. I'm really pumped for this too. So
yeah, I am. Just kind of going back to what you're saying there. It's interesting because I interact with so many young folks. And so many young people. They don't have a good understanding of what God is. I have friends of mine that, they don't want to hear the word God. They want to hear a higher power, or they want to hear goddess or whatever. And it's there's so many people trying to find themselves in faith there, and I had to go through my own process also of finding myself in faith, because you're taught, you live, and then you learn and you grow. And, I can't wait to hear what her perspectives are on that, because of the environment that we live in today, and social media and misinformation and just so many different biases that are out there, and how people associate the ills in the world with this God that doesn't get involved versus the God that we have. So it's it's going to be an interesting conversation for sure.
Yep. And so to cap it off, as my dad always would tell me, speak the truth in love. And so today
Absolutely.
we're going to speak the truth, we're going to love each other, and we're going to make this thing happen. Morgan, how's it going? Good to see you.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Morgan Lee works at Christianity Today and hosts their Quick to Listen podcast. Morgan Lee is global media manager at Christianity Today, where she elevates stories and voices from around the world in the publication's op-eds and news coverage. She's the host and producer of Quick to Listen, a weekly podcast which offers thoughtful and informative takes on the most contentious issues and news in the evangelical world. She recently produced and hosted Prayer Amid Pandemic, a limited run podcast which told the stories of Christians throughout history whose lives and faith have been shaped by sickness and disease. Her work at CT has taken her as far away as Indonesia and South Africa, sustained her passion for the global church. Domestically, she has worked to support the voices of people of color by serving the Diversity Task Force and organizing events for staff of color that work at Chicagoland Christian Ministries. Morgan has lived in Chicago's East Garfield Park neighborhood for 6 years and is actively involved in the community through church, serving as president of her book club, riding her bike everywhere, participating in community journalism, and throwing great parties when there's not a pandemic. You can find her on Twitter at mepaynl. Morgan, great to meet you.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Doing great. Welcome.
Living the dream.
Welcome.
In the mid of a nightmarish pandemic and a country in trouble. But
living the dream in the middle of a nightmare.
Right. That's the name. So we'll sort of like get right to it, because I think you offer some really valuable insights. And to us, the question of the day, we're race focused, so creating positive race relations. And right now, we sent a question your way yesterday, and I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are. And when it comes to race, the divisions these days are really higher than ever, and the problems are obviously complex. So we don't hope to answer everything here, but at least start to make forward progress. In your mind, thinking from a Christian religious perspective, what can people of all religious backgrounds and secular people do to work to heal these divisions?
One of the first things that came to my mind was that Christians are fortunate enough to have a theology of making ourselves uncomfortable. And I think of Christ's words to carry your cross, or pick up your cross and follow me. And what that immediately illustrates is that anyone who becomes a follower of Christ should not expect things in their life to somehow get easier. And I think that is really an important lesson for Christians to realize that their lives may be becoming actively more complex and more confusing, even as they're trying to live out what their faith looks like. And so if we're following Jesus, which Jesus gives us lots of really intense examples of what it looks like to have intense conversations with people who aren't like you, and confronting people who are in power and who have authority, and of just dealing with a whole variety of stakeholders who do not agree with each other, and how to live in close community with them. And Jesus says, this is what my ministry actually looks like, is all of these relationships that are going to sometimes be at odds with each other. You think of who he called to be his disciples, and he called people who were part of, basically in league with the Roman Empire, because he had tax collectors in there, and he had people who wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire in there. He also had people who were probably a little bit more politically apathetic, and people who felt like if you didn't care about politics enough, what was the point of anything if you couldn't see what was happening? It's 12 people who came from so many different places. A lot of them had ego issues, as shows up over and over in the New Testament. And Jesus asked them to live in community with him. And so I do think that that is actually something that Christians can say is like, so often we have this expectation of like, when we're actually doing the real work, something about it is going to unlock and get easier. Even though when we look back at Jesus' story, the grand like crescendo of everything that happens is that he dies, you know, and that's what ends up happening in this like very stark, tense way. And I would just say that for us, as we're dealing with all of these issues, we as Christians can just say like, yeah, we expect this work to be hard. Yeah, we expect it to be easy. Yeah, we expect people's egos to get in the way and for people to speak really passionately about things and to hold different perspectives. And we believe that that's like what we're called to, is to figure out how to build relationships in the midst of this and how to love people of all different types of backgrounds in the midst of this, even when they might be doing things that may feel a little bit unlovable.
I think that's awesome. No, it's
that was beautiful. That was beautiful. You know, when we were talking earlier, you know, I was mentioning that I was watching, you know, the funeral of John Lewis, and, you know, just reflecting on how much faith has driven the civil rights movement and all of these movements of equality, you know, over the past several decades in this country. How do you see Christianity and how do you see faith, you know, helping move that furthermore, considering that so many people, you know, don't look at faith as that motivator that it was in the past?
Yeah, there's been varying times when I would say organized religion has enjoyed mainstream credibility and mainstream legitimacy. And I think that you are right that to some extent, the authority with which we bestow these leaders has dwindled in recent years. And there's reasons in which the church and other religious leaders have kind of brought them upon themselves through some of the immorality that you see and the hypocrisy that really just starts to wear on people. And also because of just a more, I don't know, a larger buffet of options, right? Of things to kind of get into. Right. If there's nothing to do on Sunday, but go to church, maybe you'll go to church. If right. stores are open and restaurants are open and your friends don't care if you don't go to church, then clearly there's going to be less incentive. So yeah, we are in a place where you have to make an active choice to decide to participate in some of these things. Beyond all of that, I think it's important, obviously, I'm repeating stuff that other people have said before, to distinguish faith from religion too, and recognize that there is just faith. When I think of it as really all the larger, bigger ideas that really don't seem to be reflected in the way that humans actually live and work and take care of each other, right? And the idea that there are values that are outside and maybe not being practiced on the regular that somehow we can continue to aspire to and to push each other to. And simultaneously holding that all together while recognizing that we have so little that's in our control, and that God, since I will say this, since I believe in God, God is so big. And I don't know, I love prayer, for instance. And I think prayer is so important because every time I pray, I'm just like naming everything that I can't do in a situation, right? And that's not at all something that we're culturally trained to acknowledge, to just sit there and be like, well, I'm going to name all these things. And the reason the reason that I'm naming them is because my own efforts fall short of doing that type of thing. Right. So when it comes to something like accomplishing racial justice in the States, wow. I mean, seriously, can any one person do that? Absolutely not. And I think on the one hand, it's really great to look at our civil rights leaders. And I'm so glad that we've had so much time to just spend studying John Lewis's life and see what he was made of. And when you were bringing this up earlier about like looking at the faith of John Lewis, paradoxically, it's because John Lewis also knew who he wasn't, right? He knew he was in touch, I think, with the fact that like it was going to be hard for him to enact these nonviolent practices that King and others were espousing. And he was very aware of his own humanity and his own limitations. And that also enabled him to do things that look very unaccomplishable to many of us at the same time. So it's this like very strong paradoxical thing of just really being in touch with your own limits far more. And at the same time, I think that you are able to do things that confuse other people because of that.
So it's interesting because I want to sort of like, reiterate a few sort of major points. It gets harder. Doing the right thing will cause things to get harder. And, obviously that's a key point of our Christian faith. I very much believe in God, Jesus, and all that. And, the thing, though, is that human beings, we operate, oh, it's getting harder. I'm not going to do that. I'll go do the thing that's easier.
Right.
But there's a lot of proof that, yeah, it'll get harder. And things for Martin Luther King, for John Lewis, did get harder before eventually there's a sort of breakthrough point. And, that's part of the faith, believing that the other side does get better. I'm sort of curious, because what are some specific things that Christianity does and how it thinks? Because again, things get harder, but then they get better is a key point of how we think. What are some other things that have helped sort of Christianity be that sort of force that pushed abolitionism forward, that pushed the civil rights forward? What were some sort of thought processes that were useful for people to listen to?
One piece of theology that people talk a lot is the idea of every single person being made in the image of God, and that we have this stuff in the very beginning of our first book of the Bible in Genesis that allows us to confer dignity and value to every single person's life. So that is an important piece of theology. I think that really goes hand in hand with another piece from the book of 1 Corinthians. And in that part, the Apostle Paul discusses this idea, this metaphor that he uses called the body of Christ. And, I'm going to read a little bit part of it. The body is a unit that is composed of many parts. Although those parts are many, they all form one body. And then says that for the body does not consist of one part, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. Or if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, what would the sense of smell be? And what I really think is remarkable about taking those two things together, right, is that it suggests that just because we are all made in God's image, we are not all going to look alike, talk alike, think alike, operate in the same way, and even inherently understand what the other person's role is. And yet there is not, this passage is a direct rebuke to the idea of like somehow homogeneity will bring us closer to who we're supposed to be. In fact, this passage says, no, the very thing that makes you different from another person is also what makes you uniquely valuable to the community that we're a part of. I think when we're talking about things like, unity is a word that comes up a lot in conversations about racial justice. Reconciliation comes up a lot too. And so many times in these things, there's this sense of like, when we're all the same, we will be doing things correctly. Yeah. That is not true, at least according to how Paul sees it in here. He's saying that is not healthy, actually. What is healthy is for you to all to learn how to be not each other, but to work together at the same time. And he continues and he goes on and he says basically at one time, the eye cannot say to the hand, I do not need you, nor the head to the feet, I do not need you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts we consider less honorable we treat with more honor. So I also think, too, that's another rebuke of this sense of like we can be tempted to see people who do not have the gifts and experiences that we do as somehow superfluous to the entire thing that we're trying to accomplish. And again, this is the sense of the big pushback to that thing and saying like, who has the right to, declare anyone because they're not XYZ to be less on mission or less important.
It's really powerful. I'm gay as well. And when I was a kid coming up, the LGBTQ community was so discriminated upon, and by so many different, by society, not just religion. And to be able to drive around Los Angeles now and to see so many churches with the gay flag or all are welcome and these things there, it just shows how far this push, like you're saying, this difference, has been more and more accepted as we evolve more and as we start to realize and look at each other as equals. What has your experience been over the past 20 years with the three hot buttons that would be LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and of course, civil rights and systemic issues with African Americans. Has that been within your community or from your purview? Has that been contentious, or has it been something that everyone's kind of warming to? You know, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think all of these things, we all recognize them as immediately contentious, partially because they're still contentious in many ways. And from the vantage point where I sit as more of a journalist and reporter looking at these types of things, there are a lot of fault lines that still exist around all of these issues. And I think part of what's even more challenging about it is that oftentimes I've felt fortunate enough to be able to be, seen as a confidant to different people who will tell me about their experiences and the hurt that they've received because of maybe sitting in an identity that's been more marginalized. And then you recognize that the people at the same time who are many of the gatekeepers in these particular institutions have not actually sat and reckoned and contended with what that looks like. I remember reading a quote a couple of years ago that talked about, whenever you're trying to enact a particular policy, a good point of practice is to be able to think like, how am I going to explain this to the community that is most vulnerable to what that policy will make us do? And at least that forces a certain level of integrity into the decisions that are being made. But yeah, just as a reporter, it's amazing the amount of times that churches split over these particular issues. In fact, of where, we're talking about this idea of what does unity look like, and people decide they can no longer be in church community with each other. They no longer see other people as Christians because of this type of thing. And there is often a lot of just anger, right? And people talking past each other. It is really hard to decide for people to still sit at the table. For people who are part of a group, you just feel exhausted having to explain yourself all the time, to decide to continue to educate people, to decide to tell them your experience. And moreover, you may feel like, what do I owe these people to tell them my story all the time? And for other folks, there's many people who think like what I'm doing is in the history of, and comes out of this history of this tradition that I care about. And I need to be loyal and to stand up for that. And what I'm doing is exactly, what I'm supposed to do. And you can imagine part of what you do as a reporter, you talked about on my podcast, right? I talked about how we talk about contentious issues. I mean, what happens is you have those two groups and they like clash and talk past each other all the time. Mm-hmm. I feel very fortunate in many ways to have a place on the podcast that I host where I think we bring in people who are going to be more thoughtful about these things. Mm-hmm. Not like thoughtfulness can save the world for everything, right? But oftentimes trying to bring in people who have thought more deeply about something is one way to at least kind of cool things down, right? Mm-hmm. And transform what can be a shouting match into something where hopefully people are at least willing to try to see the humanity in the other side.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because like for me, for Christianity, it's sort of created this sort of like calibrating mechanism to solve some of these problems. So like we hear a new idea, naturally human beings are resistant to it. It's like we survived this long with these ideas, something new comes in, and it's like, oh, what's this threat to us? But sort of, after a while, like you said, being a reporter, once you sort of think it through, some ideas don't make sense. Some ideas you don't know, we might as well test them out. And some ideas, well, that sounds like something that Jesus would probably support or God would support, and you go with that. It's interesting because there are some places in the world where obviously religion doesn't exist. And so Christianity, like, I talked to you about how it's part of the American Revolution. It's the sort of thing where society, I was talking to this one psychologist over at USC, and he said that back in the 50s and 60s, because most people were religious, it was easy to be in the same wavelength. Because you talk about people talking past each other. Just the way we think, religion has very much been a guiding force in that. And so, how even are listening to what other person's saying, we're now actually kind of being diverging in that. We're actually very much the way Ron views the world, you view the world, I view the world, are all actually more split in a lot of ways than probably we've ever had, maybe in American history. And so being able to connect to each other, I think is a huge part. Going to race, there's things leading up to that sort of caused this thing to sort of form over here. I think we think differently I mean, am I crazy in saying that?
I think to some extent we think differently, but I also think to a larger extent, we just have access to a different vocabulary to talk about things. Yeah. I think about the activist circles that I hang out in and the words that they use to describe what they see. And it's they speak in a subculture language. I think about the evangelical circles that I sit in and the words that they have access to. I think of the situations where I hang out with people who are the same, who are the same class as me versus people who are not the same class as me. And I'm not sure if I would say inherently that people are divided so much as they just don't use the same words to talk about what they're seeing and experiencing. And then you end up with, when people talk about stuff going awry on Facebook, part of it is because for the most part, people do have people in their life who are situated to some extent in different corners of these things. And so when you're watching people talk past each other, at least my good faith interpretation is just to say like, okay, I don't even know if what you say is what you're actually like hearing or saying or what you mean. You think about all the conversations we're having about socialism and Marxism right now. I would argue that it definitely matters about where you were, how old you were, or if you were not alive during the Cold War, about how you view words like that and what they mean. Are people actually divided? I think they're kind of divided, but I think it's more about how old were you when you learned that word and who did it refer to, And I think that's true for a lot of language that gets put out there, or I just see within Christian circles, sometimes there's this sense of like, man, I really just wish Christians would stop using Christianese, which is how we joke about subculture language, or everyone turns things into religious things all the time. And I would argue that does happen a lot, but also like, how do you actually give people access to words that other people can hear in a way that doesn't maybe feel as triggering to them, right? Because if you left the church for whatever reason, it's not really fun to hear people talk about things in like Christian terms, right? Even though that may be the only way that you can like describe the world, or your best way. It feels like speaking a second language, or when activists speak about things, activists are often hyper intentional in how they're using the words. Everything that they've had has been like vetted in a sense of way of how to like do as little harm as they possibly can do, right? But for people who are not part of those circles, it can feel very controlling, very uptight, very like, why are you saying this type of stuff? Anyway, so that is my good fit. Maybe that's not true. Maybe we are actually very divided, but that is more my take.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I want to just to validate kind of what you're saying. I think you make some really good points. I think that plus with social media now and, with news being, back, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, we had 3 TV stations. And, now we have a TV station or an online media source that caters to any individually specific subject that you could possibly think of in all these. And so people are so siloed into what they're into that they're not communicating with people of different faith or people outside of their demographic or how they identify their self with. And which leads me to my question is, how is Christianity reaching out to other faiths and reaching out to people who don't adhere to, religion as you do, to have that conversation, to help them understand that they're, one of the, I don't know if Stephen told you, but I tour as a stand-up comedian when not on pandemic, but the comedian, like the preacher, learns how to talk to the audience that they're in front of. And you have to be able to, one of my favorite phrases is, I think we're saying the same thing, because belief and morals and integrity and just being a good person, those are inherent in humans. And so how is Christianity and faith in general, how do you see them interacting with people to increase the understanding in a time when so many people are being siloed away or are being so, they have these blinders on and they don't want to listen or hear anything that interrupts or goes against what their belief system is now?
In the space that I inhabit at Christianity Today, one of the movements that we've covered at various times is kind of language that talks about the common good. And I think that that is something that you'll hear in particular evangelical spaces. And obviously the point of adopting language like that is to specifically to apply to another framework of, are we doing what we should be doing as Christians? So, because is it actually advancing things beyond, helping the church, right? But it's saying it in a very like positive way. It's not being like, are we helping believers and non-believers? No, it's saying like, we want to be invested in something for the sake of our community. So I would say like measuring things up with that type of barometer is one way that I've seen Christians try to think just beyond themselves as, who's going to benefit from this particular thing. Part of the issue that many white Christians have in particular in the country that we're in is that Christians still make up the majority of people in the States. And whenever you have majority groups, the biggest privilege that comes from that is that you really only have to think of yourself in a lot of instances, and that you don't necessarily have the burden and constant reminder that you are actually in quote unquote someone else's space in some ways. And so, it's very easy for white Christians to turn very inward, especially when you're in parts of the country where there's a sharp, overwhelming number of it. And you guys are both based in LA and I'm from the Bay. And I think for Christians who are there, there's definitely more of an intentionality that might come with having to be a Christian and who you're going to have to think of, who you want to get along with and so forth. And I really am appreciative of Christians who have tried to think of who I can collaborate with outside of those spaces. Yeah, I have different examples off the top of my head. But if you're not in those spaces, then it can be obviously tempting to become a clique, right? Because that's just human nature, is you just kind of look for people that are often like you in situations. So, yeah.
Good.
Right on. I love that.
Bouncing off of that, going to sort of question number 5, because this actually ties to that. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And this Christian ideal has become so powerful that it is the core of secular culture and mainstream culture as well. And everyone supports this. And so the question we had for you that I sent you was, why is that? And I think it ties, when we think about cliques, we also think about clique breaking. How do we go outside of this thing that we love? And so like, well, why has this sort of saying, which was one of Jesus's 2 main things, why has this become so ubiquitous? Why are people attached to this idea?
I mean, I have like some thoughts. It's just like marketing of a slogan. One, it's a pretty good slogan. It's short, right? I mean, there's things about it that just like lend itself to catchiness. And it's also to some extent measurable as well. Like, I can think about how much I love myself, and then I should love other people that way. And let me just tell you that many Americans, there's nothing that they love more than, how do I know? Like, I need to know what the definition of success looks like, So this, in some ways, more than some of Jesus's other teachings, especially Jesus had the habit of speaking in stories, which in many ways is great because stories are messy and complicated and force you to like think your way through them. But, again, for our culture, some people think that like it's too much work to do this type of stuff. So the idea of love your neighbor as yourself is so pithy, right? And we love a good pithy slogan. Again, that's from a marketing perspective. As far as why it has taken on over, larger overall, I do think because we are looking for something that can like tell us how to be good people in how many words is it? In 5 words. Yeah. So I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say there's always a strong sense of, it's just because we're like really pious people, or even because Jesus is such a rock star. I love Jesus and I want to become more like Jesus. And I also think that becoming more like Jesus is exactly what I talked about at the beginning, where your life is going to get so much more complicated. I think, Jesus ends up saying this answer, right after he is asked this question, right? He said, what are the 2 greatest commandments? Love you. And he answers, love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says, love your neighbor and yourself. And then he ends up telling the story of the Good Samaritan, in which several religious leaders walk by this person who's from an ethnic group that's somewhat of a pariah in their society. And finally, the victim is not. There's just an unnamed, non-ethnically called out victim. Whereas the final person who walks by is from this group that's like this ethnic pariah. And that is the person who, of course, ends up really going out of his way to help this victim. And again, I think Jesus wants to tell that story because he wants to make it very clear of just the kind of inconvenience that this person ends up imposing on himself in a way that only we would be willing to do for ourselves. And many times, like we've all been in situations where we've gotten a flat tire, we've maybe gotten into a car accident, endured things that are hard and had to walk through all the necessary steps to kind of move through those in the world. And here in the story, we're watching this person who is, again, from a stigmatized, marginalized group decide to accompany this person to where they can stay, where they can get medical attention. And the Samaritan as well also gives a certain amount of money to help this person. And so there's financial and monetary sacrifices that are made. And for many of us who are super busy, there's a lot of time sacrificed involved that I don't think many of us would want to devote as well. So I do think for as pithy and fun as Love Your Neighbor as Yourself is, the story that it ends up sharing afterward makes it clear that like living this out isn't actually neither of those things. Not like it's not the good thing to act out, but there's a reason why it's actually pretty hard for us to live it and embody it in ways, because it will actually, going back to my point at the beginning, ask something of us.
That was beautiful. I was thinking about some friends of mine that are non-religious, and they're non-religious because of the abuses that they've lived through children, through their childhood, because of their differences with society, whether they're LGBTQ or whatever it may be, and they equate the source of discrimination with religion because of these different subgroups that work towards that. And I always point out that just like with comedians, there's good ones and there's bad ones, and not everybody sees eye to eye on different situations and subject matter. What do you say to those people who struggle with their faith, or who recoil at the idea of religion because of the wounds that they've experienced before? What do you say to them to say, hey, listen, it's okay, or whatever that may be, but here's another way to look at it?
So I would actually say maybe you don't say very much. Most people that have been hurt a lot actually just need you to sit and be a really, really fantastic listener. They need you to pick up on things that they say, and they need you to pick up on things that they don't say. They need you to notice, when they pause and when things start to get uncomfortable and the stuff that they just actually want to talk about. I don't really think that faith at all needs anyone to defend it in that moment. And in fact, especially when someone's trying to tell you their story, the last thing that they need is but actually, right? I mean, the reason that they're in pain is because they've already had that told them to so many times in the past. Right. So I don't know, for anyone that is dealing with anyone who's had some sort of trauma, I mean, if you haven't been able to hear them share their story from beginning to end first, then I would say there's nothing that you should need to pontificate about or defend about, or to try to convert people to in those conversations. There's room later for follow-up conversations about particular parts of, in my case, the Bible and how I've seen God work in my life. But I don't think God would be calling me to just, yak someone's ear off for Christ in that moment.
That's such a great answer. Like, for people listening, you're a better person than me, Morgan, but it's true. The Bible talks about this, and be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If we just listen to people, eventually as time goes on, the power of that, because that's part of loving people. You care what's in their soul. You care what's in their heart, what's in their mind. And the fact that you're willing to sacrifice, our identity comes out of us. You're sacrificing showing your identity because you want to be in the person's soul and understand by listening. It's truly powerful. And I think that's such a great answer. No, I completely agree.
And a follow-up question to that. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who was having some difficulties. And, I told him, for me, I had to learn how to forgive. Forgiveness, was such a major part of my healing myself and being able to expand who I was as a person. Explain what your beliefs are on forgiveness in your faith.
Yeah, well, I don't think that, personally speaking, you can really call yourself a Christian and not believe in forgiveness. If I was going to just like crassly summarize what the Christian faith is about, I would say it's about this acknowledgement that we have betrayed who God created us to be, and that God ends up forgiving us for that act of betrayal, and does so in a very dramatic way by sending Jesus to die on the cross. And that is the act of forgiveness by which we're able to rehabilitated and be reconciled to God through. So that is kind of what I see as the crux or the tenets of the Christian faith. And then something that allows us, I think, to be able to sit in a space to forgive people. Now, I think forgiveness has increasingly moved from something that was seen as a church thing to actually an extraordinary political act. And there's been some very public acts of forgiveness that we've seen in recent months that have provoked a lot of strong feelings. I'm not sure how many of you guys remember with the verdict in Botham Jean's case last year. And for people who do not remember who that was, he was in his house when a police officer mistakenly, according to what she said, thought that she was entering her own house, and she mistook him for an intruder and ended up shooting and killing him. And so,
very much into that,
yeah, and it was just another horrifying situation, especially because he was in his own house when he was murdered, and basically he was murdered for being in his house. Anyway, so last year at the sentencing for the police officer, several of his family members basically said that they forgave her for what she had done.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I would say that the reaction to this act of public forgiveness by his family members was very polarizing. There were people that felt like that had been something that this country really needed, this act of public healing, that it was a really beautiful thing by Botham Jean's family to go up there and to decide to release this woman from this. And I would say there were other people that felt like, whoa, this is completely, people just want their nice, beautiful story here, and they're not even kind of going to, do anything to affect the underlying issues. At Christianity Today, I actually worked with a writer named Dorena Williamson, and we published a piece that was talking about the importance of both forgiveness and justice at the same time, and how to hold this tension of like not just going straight to the wow, this is a beautiful forgiveness thing, but how do we actually call for justice in these situations? And so as Christians, we are like straddling, we're sitting in both spaces. And so, yes, I would say that we're very much called to forgive. I also think that it is important for us to also think of as when we're looking at other people forgiving, to recognize how our own biases play a role in how we're viewing forgiveness. Do we always expect people who come from more marginalized or victim groups to show forgiveness to the people that oppress them? Do the people that oppress them or the larger systems out there, are they asking for, are they asking for forgiveness as well? What difference does it make when they're asking this? There's a lot of things I think that are really important there. And I do think that, Jesus makes it very clear that we are called to forgive other people. In fact, he at one point says it's 70 times 7 is the amount of times that you're expected to forgive your brother. So infinite amount of times, more or less. But for people, especially those of us that are bystanders, when we're watching other people forgive people, it's important for us that we're doing a sense of soul searching in our own heart. And we're not just using other people's forgiveness to make ourselves feel better or in a way that would somehow cheapen what we know is an extremely excruciating act for most people.
So I think the idea of forgiveness, maybe, there's some hyperbole right here. I think that's sort of the existential question of our time, bringing this back to sort of race relations and thinking about, we think about history, we think about right now, we think about the future, and the idea of reconciliation, so forgiveness for ways that we've hurt each other. We don't do that in crime. If someone commits a crime, they go to jail. or they're fined or whatever. You know, our nature is punishment, justice, you know, for that. And so, you know, that is, you know, thinking about how we hurt each other when it comes to identity is a really huge question. And so I have a few other questions I want to approach, and maybe we'll get back to this because, again, I do want to respect your time. And I think, you know, the idea of loving somebody, going to one of the questions I asked you, is that, you know, for the positive identity, when it comes to race, we sort of follow love your neighbor as yourself model. So, you know, Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native, white, mixed, beyond, love what you are and love others the same way. And, you know, this does tie to what you just talked about, because, you know, if somebody hurts you, but you love them, you don't view that person as sort of a set in stone type thing. You view the someone that can change. You want to work to change that person. That's my first perception. What are your sort of thoughts about approaching race in the same way, from that same loving yourself as your neighbor, as others model?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that tenet is a foundation of a lot of different work that has been done around nonviolence. I was just listening to a podcast about John Lewis's life, and in that podcast, they talk about how he was, as part of his training, you're asked to view your enemy as a baby, essentially, and as someone, more or less someone who is very vulnerable, right? And has also not done anything more offensive than crying, I guess, in this instance. And something that needs protection, and that ability to visualize that sort of thing is what is going to enable you to, it's the very thing that will also enable you to then treat them in a way that kind of goes beyond that. The one thing I was going to say, beyond just talking about nonviolent practice, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who can better address that than I can do. So I am really into history, and that is probably the biggest tool that I use to kind of explain how I see the world. And I would say one of the biggest ways to love yourself is to learn your own history. That is something that I have spent a decent amount of time doing. So I'm Hapa. My dad is Chinese and Hawaiian, and my mom is white, and reading books about the history of Hawaii as a sovereign nation in the 19th century gave me a much greater sense of what it meant to be Hawaiian. And I was really thankful that those books existed, and I could learn some of what my ancestors were up to in that century. I founded a group called the East Asian American Experiment, which is a storytelling group that meets here in Chicago. And as part of it, I ask people to, or what basically your big assignment is to interview your parents and learn their stories and to share them with the other group. Many Asian Americans have this reputation for just not knowing a lot of their family's history, and that their parents are often very quiet about things that have happened to them. And part of what I wanted to accomplish in this group was to create a space for people to be able to ask the questions that they wanted to know, and also that history just wouldn't die with their parents. And to that extent, I mean, I think that the micro history, the history of your family, is hyper important. And I do think that reading books about this type of thing is also really important too, to just put all of it in context at the same time and learn about the larger events that were shaping everyone. So to that end, that I think it's really important to know your own history. It is also really important to learn other people's history. I was just watching this show that PBS did about the Asian American community. And in it, they talk about how when Korean Americans were coming over, many of them were very ignorant of the history of African Americans. And so when there was animosity between the groups, they just took it at face value, not necessarily understanding any of the larger tragedies that had happened between the white community and the Black community that long preceded when these Korean immigrants are coming over, right? And to some extent, they ended up being played in many ways because of this ignorance that they had. And on the one hand, I mean, yes, when you're an immigrant, you're in survival mode. That I'm not saying everyone has to pick up a history book right away, but I also just feel like if we don't know the story of other people's struggles and how they arrived, how their families arrived in America, or were displaced by other people arriving in America, you are doomed. They always say those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that happens over and over again.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And I want to encapsulate your point real quick. And then Rana, I know you want to jump in. Loving yourself means you care about yourself, which means you care about your own history. you care about somebody else, you care about their history. And, Ron has talked about a number of things that happened in his life to get him to where he is. Same thing with me. History is the same way. We act this way because things in the past have caused this chain reaction to get us here. And so I think that's a fantastic note. That's great. Ron.
No, I agree with you. That was fantastic. The only thing I would add to that, and is more of a statement, is, especially this goes to a lot of my brothers and sisters in the African American and LGBTQ community, knowing your history doesn't mean that you hold it with bitterness. Everyone on this call and everyone that listens, in our history, there has been, because we're human, there's been horrible things that have happened. And that's not because of any one thing. It's because we live in a complex society and humans are complex people. And knowing your history so you don't repeat it doesn't mean that you hold on to the animosities that were in that time period. You leave that in the past. However your faith is, it should include love and forgiveness and acceptance and humility. When I was watching John Lewis's funeral today, humility was one of the words I heard used for this man at least a dozen times. Just humble and knowing, I think, Morgan, you said earlier, just knowing who he wasn't and what he couldn't achieve, and, in that there's an admission that there needs to be more. Where do you see, Morgan, where do you see faith in general needs to do a better job in our society today to be able to help our all these different competing information silos and understandings to listen to each other and to communicate and commune and to break bread together so we can come together in a more civil, open dialogue discussion about where we're going as a society.
Yeah. So just to bring back what I was saying earlier about some of the erosion and trust that is being held there, and to connect it to your point of humility. In many circles, I think that Christian leaders in particular have long enjoyed a sense of respect and authority by the larger community that I'm not sure the extent to which some are cognizant of the fact that they actually need to re-earn that and to some extent maybe re-legitimize themselves in some way. And, again, it can be very frustrating. We as Americans really do not like this idea of, well, if I'm a Protestant pastor and the Catholic Church, is the one that had this giant sex abuse scandal, it's not my fault if people don't trust me because of that, because my church didn't have a giant sex abuse scandal happen in it or so forth. Why are they conflating the two? Or just thinking that somehow you should be exempt, even though, you know what, I don't think the burden should be on people who are not part of the church to be making those categorizations or distinctions between those two things. So I think I would love to just see, and this also goes back to your other point too, I would just love to see more Christians in non-Christian spaces, frankly. Again, there are so many Christians. It's so easy to always want to just hang out with your tribe and your people who already understand when you speak in Christianese, who, you can look at it and just be like, yeah, we're all on the same page here. And I would say that is 1000% not the point of being a Christian. Like, God did not just call us all to find each other and hang out with each other. He did call us to look after each other and to be there. We talk about the Christianese slogan we might say is the church being the church, right? And part of that is actually looking out for other Christians. So I firmly believe that too. But in other spaces, right, I just don't know what the actual point is of creating a space where all of you think more or less the same thing. Like if we do really believe that we have the right beliefs about something or the right actions or the right theology, then it is incumbent upon us to go into spaces that we may not agree with much for people. And of course, also with this overwhelming sense of humility, again, not to convert, but to understand what is it that is making these beliefs and ideas that I have not resonate with other people. I'm not going to try to just impose them on people. I'm going to try to understand where the breakdowns and where the gaps are, and why these things aren't landing. And further, what has been a result of hanging out in my Christian clique for so long? Is my Christian clique withholding me from conversations that I'm not a part of, that people have had without me? One of the things that we talk about in our Christian space too is how a lot of times the church is actually behind when it comes to justice issues. And to some extent, that can be true just because maybe Christians are more attached to the past or to the status quo than other people. And I would say that, but part of it is just what happens when you don't have like new ideas coming into your space, right? So it's also a place where you can really learn from other people, from practitioners and from activists and community leaders that are not seeing the same things that you are, and treat that as a gift to be in. But I would definitely say it is our engagement with people who are not like us has to come from a place of curiosity, wanting to listen, wanting to engage, wanting to figure out how to collaborate. I do not think that Christians need to pretend that they are the same as other people in the room. Personally, I actually don't find it helpful when people come in and just want to smooth over differences. Again, going back to the body of Christ analogy, I do think that can almost be extended to our country, the United States at large. And if we're in a space with other,
totally agree.
If we're in a space with other people who aren't Christians, I would say that's cool. That's exactly why you're in that space, is so that everyone there can be very honest about who they are and who they are not. And we're not going to try to flower over everyone and make everyone sound the same or look the same at the end of the meeting. It's about, okay, how can we collaborate with our differences in mind and maybe even be an asset to each other because of those very things, not how can we lead with homogeneity.
Right.
And I want to shill the Positive Identity Project for tying exactly to what you're trying to do right here. Come on, we gotta have some of the business to go. But what we're trying to do is that, we want people to follow what the Positive Identity does. And effectively, it's news stories about the positive things that people of different races are doing for each other and for the world. Because again, our perception, right now the media it feels like it's tremendously negative for how people of different communities are with each other. But you go around Los Angeles and people of different backgrounds live day to day with each other and fairly normal lives. And a lot of times do really positive things for each other. Ron and I have experienced this many times over. And so getting out of our space, and it also requires us to watch media and to absorb media that allows you to do that too. That is actually focusing on sort of the constructive aspects of society and not just the deconstructive aspects. And that's one of the things that we're doing is that we know most people don't click articles. That's fine. But if you're going through your Twitter, 1 out of every 20 articles now is something good that people are doing for each other. It starts to change your perception. And then conversely for the church, we then start to see maybe stories of people that are taking action. We'll click that and then we'll show up to an event or we'll back someone financially who needs help and go on and so on and so forth. Because, to finish that verse that you really love, I also really love it too, because, if one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. One part suffers, every part suffers with it. And we talk about having America think that way, thinking about what Christians can do today. I think that's it. Because when someone is killed, we all should suffer. We all should feel pain for that. And when people start doing things to help each other out, we all should be celebrating and finding joy in that fact. And so, I really think this is things are getting tougher right now, but as you said, bringing it back to the beginning, we as Christians know that it has to go get tougher. We have to face things we don't want, be outside of our bubble. And we're going to get hurt. But then once we break through, paradise is at the end, but we look at human history. And as a pastor, Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of history bends toward justice. And get there. So.
Think that, I think our country, I think our planet, with the way that technology is now and social media, I think we're all kind of starting to learn how to communicate differently, but eloquently. And it's not easy because there's so much fragmentation. And one of the things I've heard from you, Morgan, today, which I'm so blessed to hear, is that humility and that ability to be able to not proselytize, but to be of service and to be supportive to people in a way that allows them to have their own space. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Do you see that as the formula there's, you have this grace with you that is just so wonderful. Do you see that as, how do you see that being able to, I guess, permeate, to people that are listening to this and saying, wow, this is not what I would have expected for a person of faith to say. What are your thoughts there?
I will say for me, I try to do my best to be relatively open about my faith early on in conversations. And part of that is very easy because I work at Christianity Today. And so I easily have to explain that. Yes. And if people want to continue with the conversation after that, then they can. And if they don't, then, I have this, to me, a gift of being able to just kind of front that right away. And then you can see that. And then you can decide, okay, does this feel like a Christian that is going to be curious and interested in knowing them? Or do I feel like, I'm not in a place with my relationship with Christianity where I can sit in that conversation? So I do sometimes think that just being very upfront about it right away can help because then you know who I am and we're going to continue having that. Mm-hmm. So that's just me personally and kind of how I engage spaces. I have just been so blessed, for lack of a better word, with being curious. And I think that has made it very easy for me to approach people who are not like me. Unfortunately, well, I don't want to say people, but there are people in the world who really get excited by things that are new and different. And there are people who just love and cherish the things that they already know. Right. Mm-hmm. And it sometimes can feel unmoored when they're around things that do not feel like what they are used to. And I do think it's incumbent upon people like me who are often presenting people with new information to be willing to walk alongside people who are feeling much more uncomfortable by what is out there. I've definitely gone through stages where I'm like, why do people just so into all these very boring old things? They need to move on to that. And I have not been compassionate to this idea that there's actually a sense of grief and loss that comes with that type of thing, or just that it can just feel intimidating to be in places that feel completely new. Whereas I'm like, that's exactly what excites me. So part of that is just, again, for myself to not see those as orientations where mine is clearly better. But it's just different ways of being in the world. Right. And that other people have those giftings. I do think though, from a very not tactile, but concrete perspective, we do need better public spaces to have these types of conversations that are much better facilitated and much more inclusive of how people actually approach things in the world. I have gone to a number of marches since George Floyd died, and some of the marches can feel actually relatively transformative. Some of the marches can feel more theatrical. Some of the marches really take advantage of the space, of having these different people here and try to do something about it. Some of them don't, right? And what I love doing in life is thinking about, okay, when you have this many people's attention, when you have this type of buy-in, how are you actually engaging people in those particular spaces? So again, one of the things that sometimes I'm sad about with marches is here I have just walked 2 miles with people that I don't really know. And there's not necessarily been a way for me to get to know any more people in there. Now, again, maybe that's not the purpose of the march. Maybe the purpose of the march is just to chant and to raise attention that way. But what if there was a part of the march that encouraged people to actually have a really thoughtful and meaningful conversation with the person next to them, for instance, or to write stuff down or to make art or whatever, to take advantage of those types of things. And what I would try to, encourage more people to do is to not just settle for the kind of, in my opinion, maybe a lot of mediocre human interactions that we have these days. And I'm including digital ones in that too. But to think far more intentively, creatively, and innovatively about how you want to engage the people that you're with and how you're also setting people up to be heard by one another, right? I don't think it, as much as I want to people to learn all these different dialects of different subcultures, that's unrealistic. What you actually need to do is to be learning how to be a good translator in these things and to help people understand each other a little bit better, to help people want to continue to expend the benefit of the doubt, but also know how and when to cut out toxic actors in a conversation. And so that's where a lot of my kind of passion comes when it comes to developing skills, is how are we actually setting people up to get to see the real side of the other person on their terms and not just settling for, whatever type of social media commentary back and forth or small talk you're making in person.
Right on.
And we're sort of reaching the final point of this podcast. And I actually want to sort of wrap this around because you talked about a sort of major issue of marches. I marched the Black Lives Matter march in 2014. And when you realize, some guy took some emails of people, wrote them down. And that was the extent of it. There's nothing else. And you have all these people, this energy there. What are they doing about it? And I ended up doing Herb Wesson's Embrace LA dinners a couple of years later, where people from Los Angeles all got together, talk about race relations. And the biggest issue that people had was that they didn't know what to do with this. We had this conversation.
Yeah.
Now what? What's happening next? And your point, it sounds like we're still making those same mistakes. And so the goal of this podcast for the Positive Identity is to at least create sort of an environment where people of all races are coming together in a self-constructive, self-loving way that actualizes an outward constructive and love way towards people of other racial identities. We always ask people who come on, what's something that people can do in like 5 to 15 minutes that they can do in their own lives that can help push things forward a little bit? Maybe there's something to do with themselves, whether there's an organization, they get onto an email list where they can donate to something or something like that. Listening to your podcast, I sounds like, I want to listen to Quick to Listen, a great name for a podcast.
Thank you.
I like mentioned, but, what are some things that you could recommend people to do that focuses on sort of race, thinking about Christianity, God, religion? What's the sort of a space that you could point people towards?
Well, I'm going to disregard the 5 to 15 minute thing because sorry, that's not happening. So I have, two. One of them is personal and one of them is local. The personal one is that I would encourage everyone to be far more intentional in looking for ways to build relationships with people who are not like them and to go out of their way to do that. And that it is completely fine. And you're probably doing the right thing if you start picking up a new hobby that takes you with people who you actually have very little in common with. Now, I say that with a caveat that I'm also in a number of conversations where I hear adults complaining about friendship being hard. And I recognize that, sometimes if friendship is already hard for you, you're going to be drawn to people who are much more like you, because then the barrier at least will feel on the surface a little bit easier to click with people. But I also think that a lot of friendship is also showing hospitality. And I realize that might be difficult right now in a COVID environment when we're really being encouraged, to just spend more time by ourselves and so forth. So hospitality may look different in the season, but and when flash forward to when we have a vaccine, I think a big part of learning to build friends is being much quicker with inviting people over to dinner per your point, Stephen, and you don't need to just make it one-on-one with someone you have nothing in common with. You can bring a couple of other people that you know a little bit better, or ask them to bring people over, because that's always really great too, to get people to, to really think about how am I setting how am I setting my guests up to feel comfortable in my space? So letting them say like, oh yeah, come over, bring your significant other and bring another couple or whomever. That can be a really great way to do things. And I like dinner so much. It's so much more than being at a restaurant where you get interrupted all the time, where there's sometimes a little bit of awkwardness when it comes to the bill, when people are just fidgeting and going in and out. Dinner is a nice place at someone's house to just be able to have like more long form conversation with them. And as far as meeting people who are different than you, I think that it does revolve a little bit of creativity. Going back to the history thing, I think there's lots of history that explains why our lives are designed to not come in contact with people who are different than us. And that means that you need to be more imaginative in how you are thinking of people. So maybe that involves picking a hobby that you may have not considered before. Maybe that involves not going to a church that feels quote unquote obvious for your demographic. Maybe that involves being in Facebook groups that you didn't think of before, playing a different sport. But it may involve you to actually have to be a little bit uncomfortable. And again, that may be the whole point, and that may be a sign that you're doing something correctly. So friendships are super important. They're the people that we invite into our lives. They're the people that we ask to join our companies. They're the people that we ask to be on our board for the companies. They're the people that we ask for hiring. Like there's so many ways in which power is inexorably linked to who you are friends with. And if your friendships do not look any different from who you are, you will have no ability to influence any of that. So that's one thing. And then at the local level, what I would say is that there's always a huge intensity that gets focused on national issues. But, part of the reason that I would say like relationships are just not enough, right, is because a lot of times things bubble up because of policy, right? And I would just encourage people who live in a city, and in a city, I don't mean just like Los Angeles. I mean like maybe the suburb that you live in or the town that you live in, to be more acquainted with the politics there, and not just as you're interacting them with. Anything that we've seen with all the videos that come out is that there is not a universal American way of understanding the police, right? People do not see this police the same way. And it's very much depends on a lot of other things that are going on, right? So we have a responsibility to familiarize ourselves with how the policy that you're seeing in your government works for you and how it works for people who are not you. And then to maybe throw yourself into trying to make that policy or that rule or procedure more equitable and how it's handed out, or if it needs to change, or taking that on. But I have a frustration with people who get too into national politics, because that's actually the area I would argue we have the least amount of authority to speak into, whereas local politics, most of us have a far stronger sense of voice into those issues.
That was great.
That's awesome. To bring it back for people listening, join organizations outside of yourself. As Morgan said, you just can't be in an echo chamber. And two, you have a lot more power than you think at the local level. And definitely engage in that. And also, you matter if you love yourself, and thus your history matters. Same for the history of people that are not like you, and really engage deeply in both to understand how you got to where you are. Any last quick thoughts, Morgan, before we send you off?
No, this was really fun. Thank you guys for also being great listeners. It is truly, and I don't mean this lightly, it is a gift to be able to be asked interesting, deep questions and then be allowed to just say them without getting interrupted. I'm sorry. I used to listen to talk radio growing up, and that is what everyone loves to do. But actually, I'm not sure that you're right, blah, 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 which I'm like, okay. Like the whole like sports radio, you call on the thing and you just go back and forth. Listen, there's a time for that. The banter can be fun, but I also really appreciate just that you guys were interested in hearing what I had to say. So thank you so much for having me, Stephen and Ron.
No, absolutely. Morgan, thank you very much for being part of our podcast. Like I said, and just going off of what you were saying, absolutely. I think both me and Stephen believe that it's really important for people to hear the perspectives of people that you typically don't get to hear because of how we've been discussing, through this podcast, how society's structured right now. And you've said so many wonderful and beautiful things. And as I've said, you've done it with intelligence, grace, and humility. And I think it was really important that people hear these perspectives. And it sounds like to me at least, you've planted a bunch of seeds in people's minds that they can start looking and thinking about things in a different way. And something I just want to point out before we wrap up, something you said about inviting people over to your house for dinner. You said almost word for word to, Stephen, what was our psychologist?
Yeah, we had Deborah Warner, who was a men's trauma psychologist, and she talked.
Yeah, and she said the same thing. She was like, what happens in those settings is incredibly powerful, and I just wanted to point that out, people. This is being a human is hard work, and it just requires a lot of open-mindedness and a lot of flexibility. Morgan, how do we reach you? How does it, for all the people listening, let's get your social media.
Plug away.
How do they reach you? How do they listen to your podcast? All that good stuff.
So quick to listen. My podcast with Christianity Today comes out on Wednesdays. This week, we talked about civil disobedience, which is a fascinating discussion to have. And it actually threaded a ton of the different things that are happening right now in the world, which we talked about, for instance, churches that are opening up again in defiance of COVID measures. And we also talked about civil disobedience that we're seeing, with John Lewis and so forth. So I was really grateful for that conversation. And again, that's a show where you're hearing from an expert who we think has thought pretty deeply about something. The other podcast that I mentioned at the beginning is called Prayer Amid Pandemic. And Prayer Amid Pandemic, I think, is a great show. I basically found different people who have lived throughout history, who are Christians, and who have often lived through pandemics themselves. And we heard about how they responded during that time. So it felt, in my opinion, it took something that could have been very historic and made it more timely. So that is really cool. That show is wherever available, wherever you get your podcast as well. And my Twitter handle and Instagram handle is MEPAYNL. That's me.
Thank you so much.
Morgan, it was a pleasure. And we'll stay in touch. Anyone who shows up on the podcast is a dear friend of ours. So, well,
if I'm ever in LA, trust me, guys, I love to make friends all the time. I've hung out multiple people that I've met with on Twitter and so forth. So yes, I would love to hang out with you guys too. So thank you so much for having me again.
We'll pick up the check. We'll take you while we'll pick up the check. Who this dinner thing? We'll take care of that.
Okay.
Matter of fact, what we'll do is I live in Koreatown, and there's some of the best Korean barbecue that you're ever going to get right around the corner. And since Steven just offered, he can absolutely pick up the check. And
we'll stare down.
Korean barbecue is usually you just pay one price though, and then it covers everything. I was in LA in February and I got Korean barbecue there too. So I would love to repeat that. It was delicious. Eating out with your friends, a great thing to do when you can. So
absolutely.
Thank you guys.
Well, thank you, Morgan. We appreciate today's podcast. Thank you so much for coming in.
And stay blessed and stay healthy.
Yes. I'll do my best. All right. Take care, guys.
Take it easy.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Steven, that was fantastic.
Great. A+.
That was absolutely fantastic. She's an angel, just a very, very sweet, wealth, just a good person, just a good soul,
Here's what we're going to do. I feel like the system buries these people. I feel like there's a lot of them. I feel like people like her are great people, and we're going to do whatever. We're going to go through a brick wall to make sure people listen to people like Morgan.
Wait a minute. We just had a woman of faith on, and then now you start dropping the F-bombs the moment that she drops off. I'm
from Boston, all right? It's been like over an hour. I'm due. I think there's like a clock that's tied to us, something like that.
I just want to point out to everyone who's watching this and how wonderful I am, and I didn't just break out the F-bomb like old Steven here.
I wanted to make sure I was respectful. I think Jesus may have had some F-bombs that were omitted from the Bible. I don't know.
I'm sure he did. But I think you're right. I think that it's really important to have people of faith able to express a healthy perspective of their faith. I think that, like we were talking about earlier, so many people consume information or get information from these places that is just like, what the fuck are you talking about? And, being able to hear her, positions on these things was a beautiful thing and very illuminating. And I hope that everyone who listens got as much out of it as I did.
I know they did. And again, but this is why we're a media/social media organization, because we're going to create that network that effectively allows stuff like this to be the headline news,
Absolutely.
to be the headline approach. And I think that's, I'm very much inspired today. And so again, for audiences at home, she had 3 things that were major and important. Whatever your identity is, love that self, and then what made you what you are deeply matters. And obviously that applies to other people the same way, whether Asian, Black, Hispanic, white, Native, mixed, beyond, whatever. You matter, your history matters, and other people's history matter too. 2, we have to engage at the local level. Like, we have a lot of power. We have a lot of power electorally. Just most of us would rather sit at home and watch Netflix and do
right.
And then lastly, we need to join groups that are not like what are ideological or racial or gender or
get outside your comfort zone. Get outside your comfort zone. Interact with people. Listen. Have a communication. Don't get angry every time somebody says something that you don't agree with. Ask more probing questions. Accept that everyone is going to have a different perspective than yours, and expect that you're going to have to treat everybody with the same grace and dignity that you want people to treat you.
Totally. So on that note, Ron, another great podcast with you, buddy. I heart you. I heart you so much. And
hold on, yeah. My finger hearts are not exactly the best.
Mine aren't either.
I'm giving you the peace sign and the black power.
Yes. And I papered your black power. Oh wait, my God, that could look terrible. So on that note, we're getting out of here. We're fucking getting out of here before any more trouble happens. Ron, I'll see you soon, pal.
Hey, listen, everybody who's listening, this has been A Positive Identity. Stay amazing, stay woke, and stay active in your community.
Sounds good. Talk soon, folks.
Brother, be well.
All right, bye.